Hello everyone. Before the story start, tell me where are you watching from and what time is it?
I didn't expect anyone to ever hear this. I'm not even sure I want anyone to. But if you're listening now, it means the footage was finally released, or leaked, or maybe just quietly passed from one tired hand to another. What I'm about to describe isn't speculation or theory. It's not a story I invented to scare myself during long nights. It's a memory, and like all real memories, it doesn't unfold cleanly. It lingers. It loops. It changes how you hear silence. I worked the night shift for a small logistics facility on the edge of an industrial zone, far enough from the city that the rain always sounded louder there. The building was old but functional, a long concrete rectangle with metal shutters, humming fluorescent lights, and a control room that smelled faintly of dust, burnt coffee, and overheated electronics. My job was simple: monitor the CCTV feeds, log anything unusual, and respond if an alarm triggered. 99% of the time, nothing happened. Trucks came and went. The rain fell. Screens flickered. I stayed awake. That night was no different at first. Rain pressed steadily against the roof, a soft, constant drumming that blurred time. The monitors glowed in front of me, 12 camera feeds arranged in a grid. Loading bays, hallways, storage aisles, the exterior fence line. Everything looked the way it always did: empty, still, slightly warped by cheap lenses and low light. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, in a lonely sort of way. Like the building itself was asleep, breathing slowly through the hum of electricity. Around 2:17 a.m., I noticed movement on camera 6. It covered the far end of corridor B, a long, narrow hallway rarely used at night. At first, I assumed it was a lighting glitch. The shadows there tended to stretch when the rain intensified. But then the movement resolved into a shape, tall, thin, standing just at the edge of the frame. It wasn't walking. It wasn't entering. It was already there, as if it had always been there and I had only just noticed. I leaned closer to the screen. The shape didn't move the way a person does. There was no sway, no shifting of weight. It stood perfectly still, yet the image around it felt unsettled, like the air itself was slightly out of alignment. The corridor lights flickered once, softly, and for a brief moment I thought the figure had disappeared. But when the light stabilized, it was closer to the camera. I checked the timestamp. Only a few seconds had passed. I told myself it was a person, maybe a coworker, maybe someone who shouldn't be there. The idea of a trespasser was comforting compared to the alternative forming quietly in my mind. I switched to another camera angle, one that intersected corridor B from the side. The hallway was empty. Completely empty. No figure. No movement. Just rainwater leaking through a crack in the ceiling, dripping steadily onto the floor. When I switched back to camera 6, the figure was closer still. Close enough now that I could make out details, or at least the suggestion of them. It had the rough outline of a human body, 2 arms, 2 legs, head, but everything about it felt wrong. The proportions were slightly off, like someone trying to remember what a person looked like and failing in small but important ways. The head was tilted forward, not enough to seem intentional, just enough to suggest attention. The sound in the control room seemed to change then. The rain grew softer, as if it were falling farther away. The hum of the monitors deepened. I became aware of my own breathing, slow and careful, as though any sudden sound might carry through the screens themselves. I reached for the radio to call security, then stopped. I don't know why. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like a sense that involving another person would break something delicate, like interrupting a half-remembered dream. I kept watching. The figure began to move. It didn't walk down the corridor. Instead, it advanced in small, irregular increments, each one too subtle to register as motion until it had already happened. It was closer, then closer again, without ever crossing the space between. The camera timestamp ticked forward normally. The world insisted that time was passing as it should. My eyes told me something else. As it approached, the image quality degraded. Static crept into the corners of the screen, thin lines of interference sliding downward like rain inside the monitor. The figure's surface, skin, I suppose, looked uneven, as though it were made of overlapping shadows rather than solid matter. I couldn't see a face. Every time I tried to focus on where the eyes should be, the image blurred, refusing to settle. I checked the other cameras again. The building was empty. Every hallway, every loading bay, every exterior angle showed nothing but rain and stillness. Whatever this was, it existed only on camera 6. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in a slow, cold way. The figure wasn't casting a shadow. The corridor lights behind it were bright enough that there should have been one, stretched long across the floor. There was nothing. Just clean, uninterrupted concrete beneath its feet. I whispered without realizing it. Just a single word, meant only for myself. The sound felt loud in the small room. The figure stopped. I don't mean it paused. I mean it reacted. The head lifted slightly, the tilt correcting by a fraction of a degree, as if it were orienting toward something. Toward me. The camera feed jittered, then stabilized. For the first time, I had the distinct impression that the thing on the screen was no longer being observed. It was observing. A low sound crept into the audio feed, barely audible beneath the rain. At first, I thought it was interference, feedback from a loose cable. But it had rhythm. Not words, not exactly. More like breath shaped by intention. A whisper that never quite formed sound. I muted the audio. The whisper didn't stop. It wasn't louder now. It wasn't coming from the speakers at all. It seemed to exist somewhere between the hum of the monitors and the quiet space behind my eyes. I pressed my hands flat against the desk, grounding myself in the feel of cold metal and dust. I reminded myself where I was. I reminded myself that screens can lie. The figure took another step without stepping. It was very close now. So close that the camera lens should have lost focus entirely. Instead, the image sharpened. Details emerged, not clearer, but more numerous. Folds where skin shouldn't fold. Lines that suggested joints in the wrong places. The suggestion of a mouth opening and closing too slowly to match any known rhythm of speech. The whisper grew more insistent, still soft, still almost gentle. I couldn't understand it, but I felt it press against old memories, half-formed thoughts, things I hadn't considered in years. It felt familiar in a way that made no sense, like hearing a lullaby you don't remember learning. Then the figure leaned forward. The camera should not have been able to capture what happened next. The lens was fixed, bolted into the ceiling. And yet, the perspective changed. It was as if the thing on the screen had moved not closer to the camera, but closer to me. The background fell away. The corridor dissolved into grain and static. All that remained was the figure's upper body, filling the frame. Where its face should have been, there was movement. Not features, movement. Layers shifting, aligning, unaligning. I had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that if it ever finished arranging itself, I would understand something I was never meant to understand. Something irreversible. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the screen was dark. Camera 6 showed only black, the timestamp still ticking forward. No static. No corridor. Just absence. The other cameras were unchanged, still and empty, rain falling patiently outside. I sat there for a long time. I don't know how long. The control room clock said only a few minutes had passed, but my body felt heavy, exhausted, like I'd been awake for days. Eventually, I stood, unplugged the monitor for camera 6, and wrote a brief log entry, temporary camera failure. Investigate in morning. I didn't investigate in the morning. I didn't come back the next night, either. I quit without explanation. The footage was flagged, archived, forgotten. Or so I thought. Months later, I received an email from someone in IT. He said they'd recovered the last recorded data from camera 6 before it went dark. He asked if I wanted a copy, for closure. I never replied. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is steady and the world feels thin, I imagine what that last frame must show. I imagine the thing finally finishing whatever it was doing. I imagine it looking straight through the lens, straight through the years, into the quiet space where someone like you might be listening now. And I wonder if the reason it didn't follow me, if the reason it stayed on that screen, is because it realized something. That it didn't need to leave the footage. That eventually, someone would press play.
Please like the video and subscribe to my channel.
I found the house by accident, though I don't believe in accidents the way I used to. I was looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere temporary, a place to stay while I finished a backlog of remote work and tried to reset my sleep schedule. The listing was vague, too vague, really. No address in the description, no history, just a handful of photos that looked slightly washed out, as if they'd been taken through a thin fog. The price was low. That should have been the first warning, but the photos showed a clean, modest home surrounded by trees, and the comments, few as they were neutral in a way that felt reassuring. Peaceful. Isolated. Good for rest. The directions arrived the morning of my drive. They weren't GPS coordinates, just written instructions that grew less precise the farther I went. Turn left after the old water tower. Continue until the road narrows. Ignore the broken sign. When I finally reached the end of the gravel path, the house was waiting in a clearing that looked carefully maintained and strangely untouched at the same time. The lawn was trimmed, the windows intact, the paint only mildly weathered. It didn't look abandoned. It didn't look lived in either. It looked paused. Rain had started an hour before I arrived, light and steady, the kind that never fully soaks you but never lets you forget it's there. The sound followed me as I stepped out of the car, a soft hiss against leaves and soil. The air smelled clean, almost sterile, like it had been rinsed too many times. I stood for a moment with my keys in hand, listening. No birds. No insects. Just rain, and the faint creak of the house settling as if it were aware of my presence. Inside, everything was furnished, but impersonally so. Neutral colors. No clutter. No photographs. The furniture felt chosen to suggest comfort rather than provide it. The walls were bare except for the faint outlines where something had once hung and been carefully removed. I noticed that immediately, though I couldn't have said why it bothered me. People move all the time. They take things with them. Still, the absence felt deliberate, like an effort rather than a result. I unpacked slowly, the rain continuing outside with a patience that felt almost intentional. My phone had a weak signal, enough to send messages if I stood near a window, not enough to browse or distract myself. That suited me fine. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, the sound of rain threading through my dreams. When I woke, I felt rested in a way I hadn't in months, but also faintly disoriented, like I'd slept longer than I remembered. The clock insisted otherwise. Everything insisted otherwise. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Work in the mornings. Walk the property in the afternoons. Read in the evenings while the rain came and went. It rained often there, I realized. Not storms, just steady, background rain that softened the world and blurred edges. The forest around the clearing felt dense but not wild, the trees evenly spaced, their branches trimmed high enough to let light through. It felt curated. Maintained by someone who no longer came. It was on the fourth day that I noticed the marks on the doorframe. They were subtle, shallow grooves carved into the wood near the kitchen entrance. At first glance, they looked like the kind of damage furniture makes over time, chairs bumped too often, something dragged in and out. But when I looked closer, the grooves were too uniform. Too intentional. They ran vertically, grouped in clusters of 4, repeating at regular intervals up the frame. I traced one set with my finger. The wood was smooth, worn down by repeated contact. I tried to imagine what might have caused it. Children, maybe. A family with kids who liked to measure their height. That thought lingered longer than it should have, warming the space around it. The idea of a family made the house feel less strange. More normal. That night, I dreamed of voices. Not words. Just the sense of voices, layered and overlapping, murmuring softly as rain tapped against unseen windows. In the dream, I was sitting in the living room, the lights low, the furniture arranged differently. There were shapes moving at the edge of my vision, smaller shapes, and the impression of familiarity pressed against my chest. When I woke, my heart felt heavy, like I'd been interrupted in the middle of remembering something important. The next morning, I searched the house more thoroughly. I don't know what I expected to find. Evidence, maybe. Something to confirm the feeling that had begun to settle in me, the quiet certainty that the house had once been full. I checked closets, drawers, cabinets. Everything was empty, but clean. Not the hollow emptiness of abandonment, but the careful emptiness of removal. Someone had taken great care to leave nothing behind. In the basement, I found a storage room with shelves lining the walls. Dust coated everything evenly, except for a rectangular patch on the floor where something large had once sat. A table, maybe. Or a cabinet. The outline was precise, undisturbed, like a memory preserved in negative space. That was when I decided to look up the property. The address wasn't listed online. That wasn't unusual for rural areas, but even public records turned up nothing. No sales history. No construction permits. No tax assessments. It was as if the house existed slightly outside the systems designed to track such things. I widened the search, looking for mentions of the road, the area, anything that might anchor the place to a timeline. I found nothing. At first, I felt a flicker of unease. Then curiosity took over. I told myself records get lost all the time. Fires, floods, administrative errors. But the more I searched, the more complete the absence felt. There were no gaps where information should have been. Just smooth, uninterrupted nothing. That evening, the rain returned heavier than usual, a soft roar that filled the spaces between thoughts. I sat by the window and watched the clearing blur, the trees dissolving into shades of gray. That was when I noticed movement near the edge of the forest. Not a person. Just a shift, a suggestion of something withdrawing as I focused on it. I blinked, and it was gone. Over the next few days, small things began to change. Objects weren't moving exactly, not in ways I could point to. It was more that they felt different when I returned to a room. A chair angled slightly more toward the table. A book left open to a page I didn't remember reading. Once, I found a glass of water on the kitchen counter, half full, condensation beading along the side. I don't drink water from glasses there. I use a bottle. Each time, I told myself I was tired. Distracted. Letting imagination fill in gaps. The rain didn't help. It softened time, made days slide into one another. Sometimes I would lose track of how long I'd been sitting, listening, thinking. The dreams grew clearer. I began to see faces, though they never resolved fully. A woman standing near the sink, her back to me. A man in the living room, sitting too still. Children, always children, moving through the house with the easy confidence of belonging. They never spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence carried a quiet certainty, a sense that this was how things were meant to be. One night, I dreamed I was standing in the hallway, watching as marks appeared on the doorframe, one by one, as a child grew. I felt pride. I felt fear. I felt the strange, aching awareness that time was moving too fast and not fast enough. I woke with tears on my face and no memory of why. The sound of footsteps became noticeable around then. Not loud. Just soft, measured steps moving through the house when I was still. Always at night. Always accompanied by the rain. I would lie in bed and listen, my breathing shallow, as the steps paused outside my door and then continued on, as if following a route I didn't understand. I never saw anyone. One afternoon, I found a drawing tucked behind a loose baseboard in the living room. It was done in pencil on yellowed paper, the lines faint but deliberate. It showed the house, simplified but recognizable, with stick figures standing in front. 4 of them. 2 tall. 2 small. Their faces were blank, but the space around them was filled in dark, heavy strokes, as if the child who'd drawn it had pressed too hard. On the back, there was a date. It was decades old. I searched again for records, this time focusing on people rather than property. Missing persons. Old census data. School enrollments. I widened the net until it felt absurd, until I was chasing ghosts in databases that had no reason to connect. Still, nothing surfaced. No family that matched the drawing. No names tied to the area. No indication that anyone had ever lived there at all. And yet, the house remembered. I could feel it in the way the rooms held warmth, in the way the floorboards creaked predictably underfoot, as if accustomed to certain patterns of movement. The kitchen smelled faintly of old meals when the rain was heavy, a layered scent of things cooked slowly, often. The hallway felt narrower at night, the walls closer, like they were leaning in to listen. The whispers began shortly after. They were not voices in the conventional sense. More like the impression of voices carried by the sound of rain, shaped by memory rather than sound. They came when I was nearly asleep, when my thoughts had loosened their grip. They spoke in feelings. In familiarity. In the quiet certainty of being expected. "You're home," they seemed to say. I started to feel guilty about leaving lights on in empty rooms. About closing doors. About sitting in spaces that didn't feel like they were meant for me. I would lie in bed and listen, my breathing shallow, as the steps paused outside my door and then continued on, as if following a route I didn't understand. I never saw anyone. One afternoon, I found a drawing tucked behind a loose baseboard in the living room. It was done in pencil on yellowed paper, the lines faint but deliberate. It showed the house, simplified but recognizable, with stick figures standing in front. 4 of them. 2 tall. 2 small. Their faces were blank, but the space around them was filled in dark, heavy strokes, as if the child who'd drawn it had pressed too hard. On the back, there was a date. It was decades old. I searched again for records, this time focusing on people rather than property. Missing persons. Old census data. School enrollments. I widened the net until it felt absurd, until I was chasing ghosts in databases that had no reason to connect. Still, nothing surfaced. No family that matched the drawing. No names tied to the area. No indication that anyone had ever lived there at all. And yet, the house remembered. I could feel it in the way the rooms held warmth, in the way the floorboards creaked predictably underfoot, as if accustomed to certain patterns of movement. The kitchen smelled faintly of old meals when the rain was heavy, a layered scent of things cooked slowly, often. The hallway felt narrower at night, the walls closer, like they were leaning in to listen. The whispers began shortly after. They were not voices in the conventional sense. More like the impression of voices carried by the sound of rain, shaped by memory rather than sound. They came when I was nearly asleep, when my thoughts had loosened their grip. They spoke in feelings. In familiarity. In the quiet certainty of being expected. "You're home," they seemed to say. I started to feel guilty about leaving lights on in empty rooms. About closing doors. About sitting in spaces that didn't feel like they were meant for me. I took the night guard job because it was easy and because no one else wanted it. The posting had been up for months, quietly cycling through job boards with the same vague description and the same unusually flexible requirements. Overnight security at a decommissioned municipal complex. Minimal activity. Long hours. Solitude encouraged. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and at the time, I needed something that wouldn't ask too much of me. I didn't want conversation. I didn't want daylight. I wanted time to pass without being noticed. The complex sat at the edge of town where the streetlights thinned out and the road grew uneven. It had once housed several administrative departments before the city consolidated everything into a newer building closer to the center. Now it stood mostly empty, a cluster of low concrete structures connected by covered walkways, their windows dark, their signage faded but still legible if you looked long enough. The rain always seemed heavier there, as if the place drew it in. It drummed softly on the roofs, slid down the windows, pooled in shallow reflections that never quite dried. My shift began at 11 p.m. The first night, the supervisor met me at the gate, handed over a ring of keys, and walked me through the basics. Checkpoints every hour. Monitor the cameras. Log anything unusual. He spoke calmly, professionally, like someone reciting something he'd said many times before. When I asked how long the site would remain staffed, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "As long as it needs to be," he said, then glanced at his watch and added, "You'll be alone after midnight." The guard office was small and windowless, tucked near the central corridor. It held a desk, a chair, a bank of monitors, and a time clock mounted on the wall. The clock was old-fashioned, the kind that used physical punch cards instead of digital scans. A stack of blank cards sat neatly beside it. My name was already printed on one. I remember thinking that was oddly considerate. The first few nights were uneventful. Quiet, even comforting. The rain provided a constant backdrop, softening the silence and making the hours feel less empty. I made my rounds, checked doors that never opened, hallways that smelled faintly of dust and old paper, offices frozen in time with calendars still flipped to their final month. The cameras showed nothing but empty corridors and rain-streaked exteriors. I logged my checkpoints, punched my card at the start and end of each shift, and went home as the sky began to lighten. It was on the fifth night that I noticed the extra name. I was filing the previous shift's paperwork when I saw it on the clipboard near the desk. A sign-in sheet, standard enough, with columns for name, time in, time out. My name appeared where it should, each entry neat and consistent. Beneath it, written in a careful, slightly slanted hand, was another name. I didn't recognize it. The time-in column was filled. The time-out column was blank. I assumed it was an old entry that hadn't been cleared. Someone who'd worked there before me. Still, the date was current. That night's date. I checked the time clock. There was only one card punched in. Mine. I told myself it was a clerical error. Something left over from the transition between guards. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady whisper against the walls. I focused on my screens, letting the familiarity of routine settle me. Around 2:30 a.m., camera 4 flickered. It covered the east wing, a section of the complex that had been closed off due to structural concerns. I wasn't supposed to patrol it, only monitor it remotely. The flicker was brief, just a ripple of static that cleared almost immediately. When the image returned, the hallway looked the same as always, dim, empty, lined with closed doors. except for the figure standing at the far end. At first, I thought it was a reflection. A trick of light. But the longer I looked, the more defined it became. A person in a security uniform, standing perfectly still beneath a flickering fluorescent light. The uniform was outdated, the cut slightly wrong, but unmistakable. A guard. My first reaction was relief. Then confusion. No one had told me I'd have a partner. I checked the other cameras. No movement anywhere else. I switched back to camera 4. The figure was closer. Not walking. Just closer, as if the space between frames had been folded. The timestamp showed only seconds had passed. I leaned forward, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. The figure's face was turned slightly downward, features obscured by shadow. The posture was relaxed, familiar, like someone waiting for the next round. I reached for the radio. Hello? My voice sounded too loud in the small office. There was no response. The radio crackled softly, then went quiet. The figure didn't move again. It simply remained there, occupying the hallway with a patience that felt practiced. After a while, I noticed something else. It wasn't casting a shadow. The light above it flickered, but the floor beneath remained evenly lit. Eventually, the feed cut to static. I sat back, heart steady but heavy, and told myself the system was old. Prone to glitches. That I'd imagined the rest. The rain didn't let up. It never does there. The name appeared again the next night. Same handwriting. Same blank timeout. This time, it was written more firmly, as if whoever had signed it wanted to be sure it stayed. I didn't erase it. Over the following weeks, small things accumulated. A chair in the guard office angled slightly toward the door when I was sure I'd left it facing the desk. A second coffee cup in the sink, still warm. Footsteps in the corridor during my rounds that stopped when I stopped. Always soft. Always unhurried. The cameras began to show more. The figure appeared in different wings, never on more than one feed at a time. Always standing. Always waiting. Sometimes closer to the camera. Sometimes just at the edge of the frame, where the image blurred. I never saw it walk. I never saw it leave. One night, I found an old incident log tucked behind a filing cabinet. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the entries were meticulous. They detailed routine shifts, weather conditions, nothing unusual. Until the last page. Guard on duty did not clock out, it read. Search conducted. No signs of forced exit. Time card still punched in. There was no follow-up. After that, the whispers began. They came with the rain, threading through its steady sound. Not voices, not exactly. More like the memory of voices. The sense of someone speaking from just behind you, close enough that you could feel the intention if not the words. They didn't frighten me at first. They felt familiar. Like instructions remembered from long practice. Check the doors. Log the time. Stay until morning. One night, I fell asleep at the desk. When I woke, the office lights were off. The monitors glowed softly, showing empty hallways. The rain continued outside, unchanged. The time clock ticked steadily on the wall. My time card was already punched. I checked the time. 10:58 p.m. I hadn't arrived yet. I tried to leave after that. I really did. But each time I reached the gate, it was locked, the key heavy and uncooperative in my hand. The radio never worked when I needed it. My phone showed no signal, no matter where I stood. The rain made everything feel distant, muted, like the world beyond the fence was only a suggestion. The figure appeared more often then. Sometimes in reflections. Sometimes just behind me on the cameras. Once, I saw it standing in the guard office doorway, head tilted, watching me fill out the log. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew it was there. I began to understand. The job wasn't meant to be temporary. It was a role, passed quietly from one tired person to the next. The city didn't keep records because it didn't need to. The complex needed a presence. Someone to notice it. Someone to stay when everyone else left. Someone who wouldn't clock out. The last entry in the log is in my handwriting now. It's neat. Careful. The timeout column is blank. Sometimes, when the rain is especially steady, I think I see movement on the edge of the screens. A new figure, standing just outside the gate, waiting for a chance to step inside. Waiting for someone else to take the shift. I hope they're better at leaving than I was. Because the clock is still running. And the night is very long.
Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.